Great, thanks, Lauren, and I especially want to thank Michael for volunteering to present, not just us today, but the many different groups that he's presented to over the past 6 months in his role leading the stakeholder process for Scope 2 guidance within the greenhouse gas protocols. You've made a tremendous effort to make the process transparent and to solicit feedback from the entire stakeholder universe, and for that you are to be commended. Now, unlike many of the other forums where I've heard you, today's attendees for the most part do not represent the entities filing reports using the greenhouse gas protocols, but rather they're the investors. That's weird. Did it just mute?
Sorry about that. I had to mute all the lines. It took you with it.
I was wondering how long I was going on with.
Sorry.
Well, okay, but basically, it's the group that make the markets, the environmental credit markets, function and provide the pricing transparency necessary for the investment in sustainable projects and technology. So that's who your audience, I think, is here today with the EMA. Many of us, and I'll count myself in this camp, knew of the existence of the greenhouse gas protocols and the various scopes, but weren't really experts in the details as to how they impacted our buyers. And especially those of us in the compliance markets, we always operated entirely separately. But now we're seeing this consolidation, this evolution where these markets now are starting to have more convergence amongst themselves. And it's the impact of the protocols and this review process is making us all sit up and pay attention. And that's a great thing. Having been involved with this process, like I said, through several stakeholder associations, I also think it's a great thing that we're all starting to talk amongst each other. For the first time in what I can recall, a lot of the associations are on each other's calls, and we're really conversing about how these developments impact all of us. So that's also another great thing to emerge from this effort. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael to provide an overview of the process, and then we'll have hopefully some time for a Q&A. Then after Michael drops, we'll invite you to stay on, and we will spend a few minutes covering the EMA's proposed responses to the surveys, which, given the breadth of our membership, will focus on those areas of common interest. Of course, we invite all of you to file more specific comments on behalf of your own organizations. They'll get busy. They are due March 14th. So enough of my rambling. You're here to hear Michael, so take it away, Michael.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Lauren. And thank you, everybody, for joining today. It's good afternoon where I am, but good morning, good afternoon, and potentially good evening where everybody else is across the world. Thank you for taking time to, I want this to be more of a conversation than me talking the whole way through. So please, feel free to interrupt, ask questions. I'd like to start with a high-level overview of what are we doing and what's the purpose, and then give you a little bit of process information on just timing. Ken mentioned the March 14th close for the survey process, what happens next, what happens over the next 6 to 8 months to year to 2 years, hopefully not longer, and how does this process play out. And then really to use this as an opportunity for open questions, dialogue, exchange. I'll emphasize the priority of providing feedback through the survey process, but more than happy to exchange ideas here as well. If it's okay, Lauren, I'm going to share my screen. I've got just a couple basic slides to help guide the conversation.
Yep, go ahead. You have permission.
Great, thank you. Nothing groundbreaking in here, and as they usually say, anything here that is different from what is in the actual proposals or surveys, please reference those because they're the official guidance and documentation. So again, my name is Michael. I work with the World Resource Institute as a member of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Secretariat. What we are and what we do is work with WBCSD to co-convene the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. This is a body of resources designed to help measure, manage, and report greenhouse gas emissions for organizations across their value chain. It's a widely adopted and practiced standard. We see at least 90% of Fortune 500 companies reporting to the CDP using the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard, and increasingly adoption or reference to Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standard and related guidance materials for emerging climate risk disclosure programs, the proposed SEC rules, European Union CSRD program, ISSB. The list is growing almost by the week in terms of organizations referencing and pointing to the protocol. As we'll talk about later, that is one of the big reasons why we are doing this process to update the standards, but we'll come to that in a second. I want to emphasize this last bullet point is that Greenhouse Gas Protocols standards are developed, and the intention and the effort is this is a global process. It is a multi-stakeholder process, and everybody is part of this process. We look for feedback, we seek engagement from all parts of the world, all representations of stakeholders and interests, and bring this all together and, to the best of our abilities, help facilitate and strive towards a consensus-based outcome in terms of what new standards and guidance, and in this case, revisions to existing standards and guidance might look like. Share this slide mostly because I think we've all seen it, but it's a helpful grounding point, just again to remember, within the reporting framework, we have direct emissions as scope 1, and then there's the categories of indirect emissions from scope 2, which is energy sector, primarily purchased energy, heating, cooling, and then scope 3 upstream activities and scope 3 downstream activities representing emissions that an entity is responsible for across its value chain. The intent is, again, to capture all of the Kyoto Protocol greenhouse gas emissions. Predominantly ends up being carbon dioxide, but there are many other potent greenhouse gases which are captured in this reporting framework. So with that foundational perspective behind us, I guess really quickly I'll pause just to double check if anybody has any clarification or foundational questions on just what is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol or anything in that space. Hopefully everybody here is at least somewhat familiar with it by now. And happy to take questions as well at the end. So where are we today? And March 2nd now, we are now 12 days away from the end of the survey process. I think that's going to be a very informative date when we wake up on March 15th and see just how much information has come in through this process. Certainly intend to share that information publicly as fast as we can. But what we're working on here is essentially the first step in a very big, and this is, as I want to emphasize, first step in a long process to really collect stakeholder input as we try to understand what is the need. If there is a need, what is the scope of that need? And assuming that there is need and we understand the scope, what are the potential ways that we update and add additional guidance, clarification, related materials to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standards and guidance documents? That is a process that we are seeking to be educated and listen to stakeholders through. That is this survey process. It is the first time that we will do this in this update work. It is not the last time. There will be a lot of different ways and approaches that we continue to solicit this information, to collect this feedback. Once we have it, we will share that information and probably go through additional rounds and approaches to continue to get feedback and responses to this information. So how are we doing this? There are 4 surveys posted on greenhousegasprotocol.org. If you go to that website, you'll see a little banner across the top. It'll take you straight to it. 4 surveys listed here. 1 addressing the corporate accounting and reporting standard, the corporate standard. A second survey specifically looking at the scope 2 guidance and questions related specifically to that guidance document, scope 2 in general. A third survey focusing on scope 3, both the standard and the calculation guidance. So both of those are embodied in 1 survey. And then a 4th survey on what we're calling here market-based accounting approaches. We can go into a little bit more detail later on what exactly that embodies, but it's essentially the idea of using market instruments, whether they're certificate-based accounting, mass balance, insetting, there's a lot of different ways that you can formulate this, to use that type of accounting mechanism, which today exists in the scope 2 market-based mechanism would be an example. How do we think about that across the entirety of the greenhouse gas protocol? There's a lot of different sectors of the economy, potentially every single one of them, that have started to approach greenhouse gas protocol via stakeholders or other representation, asking for some version, of which there are many approaches to use this market-based accounting mechanisms. And this survey is really trying to bring all of those questions into a single tent so that we can explore and evaluate them on common footing. The last piece I want to emphasize here is there's these 4 surveys I just outlined. The 5th data point or communication forum here is this proposal template for how to update the guidance. And the idea behind this is essentially to say, here, take the pen. How would you update, whether it's the corporate standard, scope 2 guidance, all of the greenhouse gas protocol documents in general? What is the specific approach? What is the step forward that we should be considering and thinking about for what change looks like? Let's move this process forward by understanding what do we need to do and why. So that proposal template asks for these ideas and seeks to solicit that information, again, one, through common footing, where we're all thinking about and addressing common questions, thinking about shared ideas for how we approach this update process, so that hopefully as we get into it together through technical working groups, we can all be at least starting with some of the same questions and potentially same answers addressed. So 4 different surveys plus the proposal template, all of that we're asking for by March 14th. What is it, 12 days from now? And if you have any questions directly related to that, please either reach out to myself. There's another email address listed as well directly on this resource. Strongly encourage everybody to also just read through the process memo that's associated with these surveys. I'm going to pull out a couple important points to emphasize for everybody who is participating in this process. This is taken from the survey process memo. So again, please read that. One, just what happens after the survey closes. We, the Secretariat, will take however much comes in through this process, through the survey, work to analyze those results and prepare summaries and presentations of that information, which we will then turn around and share publicly, both through our website. I imagine I will be doing a lot of webinars and a lot of forums to communicate that information again publicly, to say, without comment or judgment, this is what we've heard. It's not sort of an evaluation or a ranking or prioritization. It's just simply to say, these are the ideas that were expressed through the survey process. Is there a need to do any updates? I suppose it's probably unlikely, but there's still some small chance people say, no needs, leave it as it is and we're done. Or likely there's a lot of work to do, but communicate back what that is. I want to emphasize that these survey responses, we will share that information with zero attribution to any individual, organization, association, or otherwise identifying connection to the proponents of different ideas. What else I want to make sure I say off this? Just to reiterate there, the survey responses in this last bullet point, we will keep this data private. The survey responses are not going to be posted online. They're not going to be put up for public consumption. They may very well become available to technical working group members later in the process. So that means there is zero intent to or any guarantee of privacy for any of these survey responses submitted. So again, please consider this as you are preparing or your organization is preparing any sort of response material. Do not expect us to treat that as confidential or private information. We just simply don't have the ability to do that, and it may very well become publicly available. The proposal templates will be treated differently. Those include a specific 2 first questions that say, do you want your proposal shared publicly? And if so, do you want it shared with attribution to your name or organization affiliation? Assuming that a party was to say, at the very least, we would like this shared, and then if with or without attribution, that will be reviewed to confirm that it's an appropriate, it's not a bunch of pictures of funny cats or something like that, that it's a genuine proposal, and then put up essentially as received. So if you ask for this to be shared publicly without attribution, but you include the name of your company in some of the responses, we are not going to go through and scrub that details out. So whatever you submit will essentially be shared as received. So there's two different ways that this information is going to be reflected back to the world. Surveys not shared directly publicly. Protocol team will summarize and bring that back to the community without attribution. The proposal templates can be shared if requested publicly with or without attribution. And so I think the first question in every single one of our surveys is, do you, sort of acknowledge and accept that your responses could be made public? So again, just want to emphasize that because we've received a handful of questions. The very last slide that I've got, and then happy to kind of open up to conversation and dialogue here, is just what is this process? We're all focused right now today and for the next 12 days, presumably, on preparing survey responses, proposal submissions. That closes March 14th. Following that, the Secretariat team will probably be a little bit less sort of available. I think we're going to be doing a lot of reading and spending a lot of our time and energy focused on just working through the content received. Nothing I say here is final, but I think we have an intention to share the sort of quantitative feedback we get through the survey as quickly as possible. So for those of you familiar, there's some questions that are either yes or no, or ranking, ordering, or something that lends itself to a pie chart or a bar graph or something like that. We'll try and share that information as fast as possible, as well as also sharing the proposal submissions as quickly as we can, and then work over the coming months to synthesize and summarize all of the survey material before coming back out to share that. I don't know how much we're going to get. If we get a little bit, you'll hear from us sooner. If we get a lot, it'll take longer to work through that. We will try and be transparent and communicate our expectations around that timing, but your patience is appreciated as we work through that process. Following that, sometime hopefully in Q2 this year, we will start pulling together both information and more details around evolving greenhouse gas protocol governance and those bodies. Also look to start pulling together and forming the technical working groups, as well as accepting people who would like to be part of pilot testing, review groups, et cetera, and essentially forming these groups and bodies, understanding, how are we going to come together and talk about all these different questions and topics. And then over the 2023 into 2024, working with this multi-stakeholder process to refine and develop what these potential revisions to the standards and guidance documents may be. And our vision is that we're finalizing publishing this material in approximately a 2-year timeline. So hopefully by early 2025. So with that, I'm going to pause. The only last message I have is, I mean it when I say it. If you have questions, if you want to have a conversation, please feel encouraged to reach out. I'm more than happy to find time for a one-on-one conversation with anybody who's interested. But now for as long as Lauren will let me, I'll happy to stick around and take questions and answer anything that may be useful. So, but thank you again for time and attention today, and looking forward to future collaborations with everybody.
Thank you, Michael. And Ken, if you want to come back on, we did get a question in. So Michael, if we submit a response about use of instruments and scope 2 feedback, should we also submit it in the market instrument survey, or can we assume that the information will cross-pollinate?
Really good question. And we will certainly be working as hard as we can to cross-pollinate. I like that. Great analogy. That said, I can't make any guarantees on sort of, if there's 5,000 comments that are submitted to the scope 2 process and there's 3,000 that are submitted to the market-based accounting, it might be hard to make sure that we're completely cross-pollinating. So be judicious and strategic, but also don't feel discouraged from, at the very least, you could put something in, say, via the scope 2 feedback, and then through the market-based accounting flag that you've provided substantial or more complete comments in the scope 2 guidance survey, or vice versa. But we will endeavor and try our best to cross-pollinate, but I've never been a bee before, so I can't make any promises.
No, and to be clear, the EMA's comments will obviously be focused on both of those, the scope 2 feedback as well as the market instrument survey. So those are obviously, I think, the two areas, which is why it's great that you're here today and able to cover the scope 2. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit more about this, how you're going to be interacting with the other survey teams, or is that, how does that work?
It's a good question. It's one that we are still trying to work around. And what makes this question tricky to answer is, what does it look like around the corner of March 14th? What's the volume? What's the totality of what we get submitted? And so we have some sort of initial thinking that there's certain areas that are just so cross-sector, cross-scope impactful that they need to be coordinated. Those other topics that are maybe a little bit more unique to one spot or another. And so how best to coordinate? I mean, I think about this from the stakeholders' perspective of saying, is it reasonable for us to ask everybody to participate in every one of the technical working groups because, you need to make sure that you're covering everything? Or is it easier to say, well, I'm engaged here. Will there be ways to bring that information backwards and forwards across those different work streams? A lot of this is going to be informed by what we get through the survey process, the volume, where is the prioritization that we see stakeholders want for this update sequencing, how to work through that. I think all of that will help refine exactly how that works. But that's, again, something that we will bring forward as sort of early communication as we start to understand a lot of that information better. Does that help? I know it's not a complete answer to the question, but hopefully helpful.
No, it's helpful. And I also think, having been involved with several of the other associations, and we're all looking at how do we gather the supporting data, and some of us are starting to look at commissioning academic research or more substantive type of data to support our positions. What I think, and maybe you can tell me if I'm correct in my assumption, is that these working groups will be able to accept, we may say in our filing on a survey that we're undertaking a process and with more data to be provided later to the working group. Is that a fair assumption that, this isn't like, well, March 14th is a deadline that we need all respect. It's not like we stop talking on March 14th.
Yes, very much so. And I think we've been asked this question a handful of times around, we'd like to, exactly like you said, we'd like to commission research of one shape, form, or format. Research takes time. You got to find funding, then you got to find somebody to do it, then they actually have to do it, and then they've got to review and vet their findings, potentially go through peer review processes. Many lifetimes ago, I was much more involved in academic research. It takes time. And so given the competing tensions here of, I would love to be able to snap my fingers and say, voila, in April, we're going to be able to provide all the markets the certainty they need to understand whether they like it or not. Here's the future. Now we can all start, going with it. Or do we say, well, it's going to take 3 or 4 years to do the research. Let's all just pause and say whatever contracts we sign now may be moving in a different way than what happens 4 years from now. The best I can do here is to say in this proposal or in the survey response or proposal, what's the research hypothesis? What's the question that you want to explore? To the extent that you have an expectation around timeline, to share that as well. But that at least puts down sort of a placeholder, a milestone that says, we're investigating this, we're exploring this, we anticipate bringing more in, we're aware of that going on. Potentially you crowdsource some of the research as well to other parties or groups as well. But very much recognize the sort of tension there between we want to move forward effectively and efficiently, but we also want to give this enough time to play out and explore some of those questions. Last thing real quick on that is we also envision a new potential approach here that brings in, it's a lot easier to do small changes more frequently than big changes less frequently. And so the potential that, if that research takes several years, maybe that can be informed and continuously evolve things going forward. So trying to be more adaptive and nimble as we move forward in time with how the protocol continues to keep up and support all the different reporting and disclosure programs.
And I'll once again invite questions from the audience as well. So it's not just a dialogue here, but one other question I was going to ask you was regarding, we have so many policy determinations being issued. Just last month we had the EU issue their green hydrogen rules. How do you see the greenhouse gas protocols evolving to encompass these decisions that are being made by different regulatory bodies around the globe?
It's a really good question, and one that we are paying a lot of attention to, seeing the EU green hydrogen, anticipating something in the US for the 45B production tax credits. You've got ISSB reporting requirements, EU CSRD. Whenever we get the United States SEC guidelines, I just saw Japan is starting there, putting out a disclosure draft for ISSB soon. All over the place, all of these things are popping up, cropping up. One, it's challenging to keep up with them all. So I actually welcome everybody that as you see these things, please don't feel shy to share it with us. Don't assume that we know everything, because I'll be the first to say that I don't. And so just even when people say, hey, did you see that, in Australia, there's this new reporting disclosure program or something like that? My answer is probably no. I haven't seen it yet, but thank you for sharing it. How the greenhouse gas protocol integrates and interfaces with those programs, I think one, we are working to understand ways that we can establish dialogue and communication with those organizations, bodies, agencies, commissions to say, how do we find as much harmony as we can here? There will be times where for policy reasons, for political reasons, those types of program and standards take a different direction that few people would argue is intended to be aligned with greenhouse gas protocol reporting. Someone might say, we want to really support local jobs, and so we're going to put requirements into a program that dictate and prioritize or give credit to a certain outcome. That's a different accounting measure than what the greenhouse gas protocol does. But where we can find that alignment, simplify reporting, many organizations will probably be subject to multiple jurisdictional reporting requirements. How can we make these as harmonious as possible, provide the information that they're all seeking? And that is a high priority for us. That is something that we're very keen to understand and facilitate to the best of our abilities.
And hopefully it's a two-way street too, where the
yes,
regulators and the policymakers are having conversations and looking to incorporate your guidance into their work.
Yes, very much so.
Other questions from others in the audience? Everyone's got, no one wants to be the one to actually make the conversation. Well, no, I do appreciate it, Michael, you taking the time today. This is, hopefully the start of a very important process over the next. I guess the last question I'm going to ask, and I know you've given an answer before, but just to give people, I think another aspect that you've maybe covered in some of your previous conversations is that the WRI and WBCSD may be looking at how they're organized as well as part of this effort, that there may be some internal changes to try to address how this is going to play out. Do you want to touch on that at all?
Sure, yeah, happy to. And I think it's, it's trying to be responsive. It's trying to listen to what stakeholders say, what the experience is, working with the greenhouse gas protocol as a standard setting organization and body. Every standard setting body is different, whether it's voluntary or regulatory. They all have their own rules and procedures and practices. We've went through an exercise to try and solicit some stakeholder feedback, understand, what do we do well, where are the areas we can improve, and how. Working through that to try and improve transparency, give better insight and understanding to our decision-making process, and to sort of bring in more formally and transparently how decisions are made. Again, it starts with driving towards consensus and stakeholder groups. I recognize, my eyes open, there are times where it's really challenging to find consensus on very important topics. And so how do we escalate those? How do we bring them to a sort of decision-making process that is both transparent enough and fair enough that, and this has happened to me plenty of times in life where I disagreed with the outcome, but I agreed that the process was fair. And I think, that's where we're driving towards, is to say, we understand what our objectives are. That's something that, we need to improve and clarify and communicate. Once we understand those objectives, our mission, our vision, the strategy, where is the protocol headed, and what is it intended to report and to capture, that we understand how those decisions are made, who's making them, and what that process is. So more to come on that as we continue to evolve and improve and enhance our stakeholder and governance process. And it's a lot going on right now, because we're both trying to do the survey process, but also stand up and improve our governance body. But I guess that's one area that I also welcome anybody's feedback in terms of, if there's processes, if there's, whether it's voluntary stakeholder space, regulatory engagements, that anyone on this call says, hey, this is a gold standard, or at least best practice, I wish the protocol had more of that type of sort of process or decision-making criteria, engagement, et cetera. I'm all ears. I really would love to see more examples and references on what that type of process is, because I think the more that we can kind of bring everybody and have this be a community effort, the better the outcome is, and at least our ability to sort of understand how and why we got to the outcomes that were derived.
And that's fair. I mean, and I really do appreciate you taking the time and being transparent with us today to try to explain the process and because there is a lot going on, which is a good thing, but it's also a little bit overwhelming at times. I know you're probably tired of talking, and I'm definitely tired of reading. So there is so much to be said. But any other last minute questions? Anybody else in the audience have anything else to say? Here's your opportunity before your March. You have to turn in your homework on March 14th. So. All right, class. I guess you all have all the answers. So please put them on paper and submit to the survey as Michael requested.
Well, I wonder, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Jeremy.
I mean, I think we've got a lot of people on the phone, and Ken, you have invited dialogue, and I think it might be helpful, Michael, if you were to just talk to people here who are on the phone today and kind of say, all right, well, what is going to be most helpful for you? So, for example, it's like if it's going to be much more helpful for you to say, all right, well, I want data. I really want to know and understand. Hey, is there more development of renewable resources because of RECs? Is that going to be helpful, as opposed to arguments saying, well, RECs serve these policy objectives that I think you should be that are important and should be advanced?
Then either or, because I think both of those are, and I'm not trying to be flippant in my response, but I do think that both of those are valuable perspectives. They both help inform, again, thinking of what's the need, what's the scope, and what's the potential approach to move forward with. All of that is going to be helpful information. The question that you started with, I also want to emphasize, in providing these responses, we're trying to use this, again, to understand exactly that of the need, the scope, and the potential approaches. This is a first step. It's something we will try and, as I try and think through even in my own head of what are we going to do with all these comments, it's to be informed by, and then in turn share so that everybody is informed by all of the collective feedback we receive, which is potentially different from responding to all of the feedback that we receive. So kind of highlighting that distinction here is this is the chance to provide that input. What's the need? What's the scope? What's the potential approach? The rationale, the justification, the thinking. Hopefully through both the proposal template and the survey questions, there's room, Jeremy, a little bit for both of those in different places, whether it's providing, the evidence or here's a causal linkage or here's a way to conduct that evaluation fits really well in this question. And then more on sort of, well, what's the overarching global theory of change, or what is the protocol trying to actually, when somebody says my emissions are this, and then I do this action or I cause this change and I report different emissions, why and what went into that is captured in some of the other questions. So I think both of the things that you outlined are important and valuable, and it's really, again, helping inform what's everyone's collective perspective on what we do with that information and what's out there. Is that helpful as a response?
It is. Thank you.
Wonderful.
And one of the things I think we're going to be asking all of our members who may have an opinion on this, and I know some of our members do, is if you can point to specific occasions where the resale of the credits was a consideration and an important consideration in the project moving forward. The concept of additionality, to the extent that you have concrete examples, I think is going to be useful to present those to Michael.
Yeah.
Obviously the studies, the academic research, we'd love to have, a full-fledged study that shows this amount of projects was developed basically with the important consideration to RECs. Those are the types of things we're hoping to start working on, but individual members that have projects, or especially I know we work a lot with electric cooperatives, for example, who invest in PPAs with the expectation of reselling the credits as part of the financing of the project. So they may not be the project developer, but they're still looking towards the revenue associated with the credit as part of their decision to enter into the PPA. I think those are maybe some of the things that hopefully would inform the Scope 2 debate. Is that a good assumption?
That's very helpful information to just richen the conversation and add that perspective in is helpful.
And Michael, one other thing, on one of the questionnaires, it refers to an aggregational theory of change, and I haven't really seen that in the literature. Is it known by other names? I mean, could you maybe tell us what the aggregational theory of change is?
That is a good question. If it exists in specific literature or other places, I think at the highest level, it's just that fundamental theory of supply and demand, is that if you have enough demand, then supply changes to meet demand. It is discussed, I know, in various places within the corporate standard, where it outlines, particularly around some of the indirect emission accounting discussions. I am blanking off the top of my head what specific chapter or section to look at, but Jeremy, if you wanted to follow up, I'm happy to point you to some of that language, but it's sort of in that general space of which I would hope to some degree also just the question itself gives some of that context on that aggregational theory of change, to say you get enough people doing this approach that it leads to these outcomes, is part of that framework. So specific examples where it's discussed outside of the protocol, I'd need to go think and look about that, but it is certainly something that's discussed in various shapes and flavors across the Scope 2 guidance, Scope 3, and corporate standard for some of the theories of change embedded in that.
Thank you.
And be aware, I'm sure everyone on the call hopefully is aware that what we're talking about with Scope 2 and the market-based surveys is the fact that there's a review both of the current use, whether it should be continued for Scope 2, whether it should be expanded for Scopes 1 and 3, should they be modified in whatever way. So this is a very open discussion that impacts really all of us, I think, here that are involved in these credit markets. So, this is something that we need to be, paying more attention to, and I really do encourage everyone to weigh in.
Absolutely.
Anyone else while we have Michael? All righty. Well, I do appreciate you taking the time today, Michael. I mean, I know you're a man in demand. So, and I know after March 14th, you're probably going to be holed up somewhere doing a whole lot of reading. So I don't envy you on that, but I do thank you for taking this time today.
Absolutely.
And, I encourage anyone that wants to stick around for a few minutes. We're going to go through the EMA's at least general thoughts on their comments. We're going to we have a meeting scheduled for Monday to review and then solicit. I know it's a little bit last minute here, but we are hoping to file then we'll take whatever feedback we can till Friday and then file the following week. So that's our very, but once again, given the association's breadth, the number of questions that we're expecting to really respond to is somewhat limited. And that's why we encourage individual organizations to submit comments that can maybe be more broad and more focused on the specifics that they want to go towards. So
looks like there was one more question that came in. Did you see that?
Oh, can we submit all our comments regarding to 4 topics in just one proposal document? Certainly feel free to respond via the proposal template, which is, I'm assuming, the proposal document, same thing as the template. In a lot of ways, yes, the proposal template is reflective of corporate standards, scope 2 guidance, scope 3. You can certainly talk to and speak to either one of those very specifically, or that very sort of at large. Please be conscientious just about the volume and the amount of information that you provide through that. If you have responses to specific survey questions and they're embedded in the proposal template, that might be a less efficient way for us to just collect and sort of be synthesizing that information in the sort of most effective way. So to the extent you could use the surveys, you certainly don't need to answer every single question in each survey. Even just answering one question, if that's the one that you want to talk about, go for it. I'm actually happy if somebody does that, because it helps give the signal more strength over the noise. But certainly, I think you can also speak to a lot of that stuff across via the proposal template. So, but thank you again, Ken, Lauren, and everybody. Really appreciate the opportunity, and I mean it. If you have any questions, you want to reach out, have a one-on-one conversation, Lauren and Ken, please feel free to share my contact information with members, and looking forward to continuing the conversation as we move forward.
Definitely. This is only the beginning.
Thanks,
Indeed.
Michael.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
All right, and everyone
All
else
right.
hang out.
Yes, for those of you that are still here, I do appreciate everyone's attention on this. I mean, this is something that I think a lot of us, those I'm sure some of the other associations have been, and other folks have been involved with the scope 1 guidance that was released as part of the land use change guidance that specifically removed crediting structures from use in scope 1 with biomethane. And then there was, I think a lot of us are familiar from, the presentation Christian gave earlier this year regarding the pushback that the scope 2 was getting from certain corners regarding the use of credits and additionality. So, this is one of those situations where the more voices that we raise, the better it is for all of us. We are, understand that we don't have time to publish like the other side did in an academic journal, their quote unquote research that attempted to show that RECs have no value. But at the same time, we are scrambling and looking at funding different types of academic research to support the amount of money and the actual argument of additionality that these credits give to project developers and or to PPA buyers and or to investors. So that this is a legitimate resource that is actually driving sustainable, emissions reductions. So to Jeremy's question about the Monday meeting, what we had intended, it's a board meeting, but we were going to submit the draft, have the board approve a draft, send it out to the membership, and then have the membership comment. But like I said, and kind of like what Michael alluded to, we only plan on answering several of the questions and being at a very high level, because I know there are a number of opinions, especially when we get into some of the questions are, how should the protocols be changed? And if there are some people that are very content with the protocols as drafted and want to see no change, there are others who want to see changes. And we're not going to try to referee that discussion. I think the biggest thing we want to weigh in on is that argument that the dollars that are being spent in the credit markets are finding their way to developers, and that projects are being developed because of the credit markets, that they're efficient, that they're leading to the decrease in technology costs and implementation costs. And so we'll probably literally focus, and some other associations I know have had the same issue, we'll probably focus on maybe 5 or 6 questions tops between the two different surveys. Because like I say, if we start getting into how do you want to see the programs changed, that's not for us at this point, I think, to say anything. And Jeremy, I do welcome your comments too, to the extent you have thoughts and you want to help us, recognizing that the EMA, for quote unquote, comments are going to be pretty vanilla. So number one, I of course encourage you to submit your own, and number two, to the extent you can draft or help draft comments that reflect the broader consensus, please reach out to me.
Well, I appreciate it. I mean, what has been the comment draft development process so far? Because I know we had policy meetings and then I didn't really hear anything about actual drafting, so I'm not sure how they've been developed today.
It's been very ad hoc, I'll be honest. I mean, that's the unfortunate thing, being a volunteer association. We've been participating, at least I have been participating, and I know a number of other associations have had much more formal processes, whereas they're obviously more, they have a full-time staff that's dedicated to filing comments and has been more into the policy framework. Ours have been, Christian and I, in our roles as the policy advocacy committee chair, and his committee as well, have been having a dialogue. But that's where I say we will probably be filing we want to basically put our stake in the ground that we are engaged, but also understand that we have to be very vanilla with this group.
Understood.
So would you like people, if they do have feedback, to send it to me or to send it to you? What would be most
Please
helpful?
send it to me and I'll share it with Christian, and to the extent, you have specific questions that you think that we should address. I was really looking at a limited number of questions on just the scope 2 and the market-based accounting surveys, not even addressing the corporate reporting, obviously, but even scope 3. The one area that I find interesting is, and I know other groups have maybe talked about this, but even this might be controversial for our membership, is the convergence of the quote unquote compliance markets with the voluntary market, and how do we harmonize reporting from, as some of these RPSs now are becoming so more significant, that it really is, incumbent on the buyers to be able to utilize the reductions associated with their RPS compliance in their reporting. And somehow the market-based structure can that harmonize in a way that makes sense. the problem we run into, candidly, is, there's a movement for temporal matching. There's a movement towards geographic, limiting the geographic scope, tightening up the actual requirements. And I know there's the 24/7 movement going on, which is, which I have my own personal opinions on, but, the EMA as an organization will not be able to speak with one voice on those. So please feel free, like I said, number one, submit your own responses as you see fit. Number two, we'll be trying to, we've been working with a number of associations on getting research, getting academic institutions engaged, trying to get some more hard data, if you will. If you have, what do you call that? Examples that
Case
you wish to
studies.
share. Yeah, case studies, exactly. If you have case studies, that would be awesome. I know it's still a little one-off, but it really is, I think, speaking to the, we need to refute the argument that was put out by the Gillenwaters of this world that what we do has no value in the environmental world. So that's what's on the table, and the unfortunate thing was the folks at Concordia, who were hired originally by the WRI to lead this process and to be involved with the aggregating data, have come on the record with their paper saying that exactly that the rec market has no value. So we need to show up and make sure our voice is heard and engage in this. We can't afford to ignore it.
And I just wanted to remind everyone, if you go to enviromarkets.org under committees, we've put together a webpage with documents supporting links, helpful deadlines, things like that. So, and I think we were going to put together a little fact sheet, but we'll probably put together our responses. So if you need a reference point for your own company responses for the survey, there is some guidance on there, but ultimately it's up to what your company decides, and EMA will be sharing next week what we put together.
Any other questions, comments, thoughts on the group? And please do feel free to email me. I know it's a tight deadline. I know SEBA has been working on this for 13 months, and we're working on it for 13 days, but
13 weeks.
Well, yeah, we have been engaged, obviously. I'm being facetious, but please do reach out and share with us your thoughts.
Okay. We'll have the recording up in the next day or so. Thanks, Jeremy, for posting that. Appreciate it. You're hired. You're on the staff. And as a reminder, if you didn't hear at the top of the hour, we have 2 in-person events coming up. So on May 4th, we are doing an event in conjunction with IEDIT, the first time ever in New York City, with our sponsor host, S&P Global. That is for members only. So you must be an active EMA or IEDA member to join. They will be issuing their registration code. And then we have announced our annual meeting dates. They will be October 1st through the 3rd in Denver at the Interlaken Hotel. That's an Omni property. So you are the first to know, and we'll have more webinars, more communication coming your way. Ken, thanks so much for the quick response and getting Michael on and coordinated. And I hope this was valuable for everyone on the call today, and everyone be well.